veteran. My father and my stepfather both served. My dad was in the Army and my stepdad was in the Air Force. I have taught so many veteran students over the years, and while we were talking about different types of learning and cohort learning and how awesome cohorts were for students, I had a couple of veteran students that were having some problems that were coming in my class, my office a lot. And it just got started me thinking, what's going on with them and what can we do to help them? So I started kind of researching this, and this became, not just a dissertation, but something that's really important to me. And when I started to do research, I found out that there's almost no research about the transition of veterans into higher education, except that we know that they don't do really well transitioning from the military into higher ed. And we're talking about enlisted individuals, because officers have some type of degree already. So there's not really any published work that seeks to understand what the difficulties are from the veterans' perspective. There's some work about, homelessness. There's work about difficulty with the GI Bill and things like that. But there's nothing that actually says, okay, so what do you think is difficult about the situation? And any research that you have is all about four-year universities. There's almost nothing about community college. And what's really crazy is there's nothing about community college, but 43% of veterans that access higher ed choose community college first. And that's over, so 43% choose community college, 21% choose a four-year, 13% choose a private nonprofit, 12% choose a for-profit, and then 9% have dual enrollment in a lot of places. So that's a big chunk. That's almost half are accessing community college, and we don't know anything about the transitional process. And when you do study about the transitional process and look at programs for military veterans and services for veterans, they're concentrated at four-year universities. New Jersey has a really good system. Texas has the Gold Ribbon program. There's lots of different programs at four-year universities, but not for community college students. So the purpose of the study, why is this not working? There we go. All right, so basically what I want to do is understand the perceptions and viewpoints of veterans towards their transitional process. I want to look at the difficulties that they face. And I did this using something called Q methodology. And when I submitted my abstract, the comments I got were, tell us what that means. So Q methodology, basically, you take your theoretical framework, just like you do with any type of qualitative or quantitative study, and I chose to use Schlossberg's transition theory, moving in, moving through, moving out, and coping strategies. In order to go through any type of transitional event, you have to have these coping factors. Schlossberg talks a lot about how the way that you deal with a transition has to do with, was it expected, was it what you imagined that it would be, what kind of support did you get, and how did you cope with it? And just looking at that made me think, well, gosh, maybe one of the reasons that veterans have a hard time transitioning is they expected to go to college, but it's not what they thought that it was going to be, and so they kind of get stuck. And then I looked at self-determination theory, which basically, it's Ryan Deasy's theory about your environment kind of shapes your success, and then your intrinsic and your extrinsic motivation. Do you have inner drive? Do you have support from the outside that helps you get through a transitional process? So I took that theoretical framework and said, well, what's the best way that I can look at this and study this? And then I started looking at some other things, because this is not purely a theoretical issue. When we talk about military veterans, we're talking about what their experience was before they left the military and what is their experience after they leave the military. What is really big and different about this transitional process? And one of the biggest things, I think, is the disparate andragogy that we have. In the military, you learn a certain way. And in higher ed, you learn a completely different way. You could learn the same way, but you might not. So in the military, you use the ADDIE model: analysis, design, develop, implement, evaluate. I have two veterans in this room, and I'm sure that you remember training in this fashion. You basically learn, you learn to field strip a weapon, And the way that they test you is, did you do it right? I mean, basically, right? You learn to do certain things and you're tested immediately. It's kind of like we were talking about yesterday. You know, it's cognitive, it's behaviorist, it's spitting back out the information. There's not any higher learning. There's nothing about, why am I learning this? How does this pertain to, you know, the big picture? Then you go to college, you get into higher ed, and there's academic freedom for professors to teach however they want to teach. You can have a flipped classroom. You can have a cognitive or behaviorist instructor who lectures. You could have somebody who believes more in self-directed learning. You could have somebody that, you know, believes in more of the humanist perspective, like we were talking about yesterday. You know, wisdom seeking. This is not something that you use in the military at all. So if this is the way they're used to learning, maybe this could be an issue that we're looking at as well. So my conceptual framework, basically, I set it up so that I wanted to look at these perceptions, and I took into consideration 4 different things. I wanted to look at branch of service, and I chose to look at Marine Corps and Army veterans because they have the hardest time with completion. The 6-year completion rates for veterans out of community college are 52% overall, which is actually better than non-veteran students. Non-veteran students' completion rates are 44%, but the 6-year attainment rate is longer for military veterans. The Air Force does the best. 67% of Air Force veterans complete, 54% of Coast Guard veterans complete, 52% of Navy veterans complete, 47% of Army veterans complete, and only 45% of Marines complete. And so I chose to look at Army and Marine Corps veterans because they have the worst completion rates. And I figured if you can figure out something that will help those that have the worst completion rates, it'll probably help those that have the best completion rates as well. Community college overall is relatively difficult because we're often talking about non-traditional students, and military veterans are very much non-traditional students. 33% of them are married with children, 15% of them are married without kids, 14% are single parents. One of the biggest things, I think, is that 70% are part-time students that work, which is typical of a community college student, having a part-time enrollment. 85% of veterans are of older or what's non-traditional age, is kind of what they call it, between the ages of 24 and 29. 73% of military veterans in higher ed are male, only 10% are female, but we do think that that's going to rise. Very diverse ethnicity, 60% are first-generation college students. If you're a first-generation college student, you're 50% more likely to drop out of school than if you're not. So 60% of veterans are first-gen. So that's already kind of something that they've got them against the wall. Only 5% identify as disabled, and that's self-identify. So that's one of the things that we look at. But based on all of those different factors and demographics and things like that, I said, well, I'm going to look at Army and I'm going to look at Marine Corps. And I'm also going to look at their MOS. MOS is your military operating specialty. What was your job when you were in the military? So I asked each individual to tell me what they did. And then a lot of them would start spitting out numbers to me. I was, oh, blah, blah. I'm like, no, I'm not that good. I'm good, I'm not that good. You've got to tell me in words what you did. So I found out what their MOS was. Then I took these demographics. And I also asked them to rank on a scale of difficulty. How difficult was their transition into community college, in their opinion? On a scale of 1 to 10, how difficult was it? And I took all this information and I put it into this thing called a Q-sort. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second. And then I did a factor analysis, which is a statistical program. And with the factor analysis, what you do is you take your data and you come out in 4 groups that identify with each other, and then you can try to get some policy out of that. So here were my research questions, which I already pretty much talked about. What were the viewpoints? What distinguishes the groups? And do the viewpoints vary according to MOS or branch of service? So even though I was looking at only Marine Corps and Army, I thought, well, maybe they'll be a little bit different. The culture in the Marine Corps and in the Army and in the Navy and in the Air Force is very different. Individuals that were in the Army will tell you that. Individuals in the Navy will tell you that. And goodness, don't ask a Marine, if they're like any other branch of service, because they're, Marines are Marines for life. I found that really early on. I asked one of my students something about being a former Marine, and he was like, no, I'm a Marine. Yeah. I'm like, okay, I'm sorry. So we're going to look at that. So significance, I want to develop better support services at the community college level. I want to aid in retention and graduation to influence labor market outcomes. I want people to get a job. And the big issue for me is that social demographics, homelessness and poverty is rampant in military veterans, and I just find that horrible. If you're a military veteran, you're twice as likely to be homeless as any other member of the population. Male veterans between the ages of 45 and 54 are twice as likely to be homeless than any other individual. And female veterans between the ages of 18 and 29, immediately upon exit from service for most of them, are more than twice as likely to be homeless than other segments of the population. Male veterans are twice as likely to live in poverty as anybody else, and female veterans are 4 times as likely to live in poverty as any other member of the population. And to me, that's unacceptable. I mean, completely unacceptable. Veterans comprise about 1% of our population. Just 1% of the U.S. population are military veterans. And of this 1% of the population, we see a 4 times greater chance overall of homelessness and poverty than anybody else. And part of the reason that I think this is an issue is because we don't help them be successful in seeking jobs outside of the military. How can we aid veterans in being successful outside the military? Well, maybe we can start at the community college level, because one of the big things about the military is you get your GI Bill. You can use your GI Bill to go to school for free. And so if you're utilizing your GI Bill, maybe we can work this out in a better fashion. So this is the big reason for me that I wanted to look at this. Maybe there's some way that we can kind of look at these social issues and address them through this. Limitations, I only looked at Army and Marine Corps from North Carolina. Most of them were people I had taught over the years. Delimitations, again, only enlisted Army and Marine Corps participated. Concourse items, and I'm going to talk about my Q sort in a minute. Basically, your concourse is all the different questions that you ask them to sort out. So let's talk about that Q sort for a second. Obviously, this was my review of literature. I looked at all these different issues to try to get some background information. I only found 2 studies on community college other than mine, and one was by one of my committee members, so I knew that he was writing it, and one was by another individual at NC State. So, and I did exhaustive literature searches. Since I finished my dissertation, I've seen one more paper on community college transition. So this is not something that we're really focused on. I went to TAP class. I called up, I went to a conference and I met a retired general from, who had overseen Fort Bragg, and I talked to him after his talk, and I asked him, I was asking him what did he think about the transitional process, and he was not super happy. He was more of just, I said, what did he think about cohorts for military veterans in college, and he said, I think that's a horrible idea. They just need to transition. Okay. I mean, not helpful. And I said, well, do you know who's in charge of your TAP courses? Because I would really like to come and see it. A TAP course is a week-long course that all veterans take before they exit the military. In the Army, it starts about 6 months out. They start asking you a couple of different questions, and then it culminates in this week-long class that you have to take before you leave. And they talk about how awesome this is, and this should really help you transition. What I had talked with individuals about regarding the course didn't really match up with what you read about the course from the Department of Defense. And I wanted to go myself, so I asked the guy for contact information, and he gave it to me, and I got permission to go sit in. I got to be on Fort Bragg for a week, so that was... Fayetteville, North Carolina is honestly the hottest place on earth. I mean, it really is. And if you ask the guys there, they'll tell you because it's a little bit closer to hell, but it was hot. But it's a week-long class where you basically learn how to write a resume, and you learn what your MOS translates to. You do a thing called the MOS crosswalk, and you put in your MOS into a computer program, and it tells you what you could do. And if you're infantry, it comes up with like fireman and police officer. I mean, there's hardly anything. The TAP course is broken up into rank, so it was like E6 and below, and then E6 and above, all the enlisted ranks, and then there's a separate TAP course for officers. But the TAP course for the lower enlisted ranks and the higher enlisted ranks is exactly the same. So it's not different according to your rank. It's not different according to how long you've been in the military. It's not different according to your job or anything. And really, it was just focused on, this is how you write a resume, this is how you get a job, this is what you wear to an interview, this is how to use your GI Bill. There was nothing about higher ed. There was nothing about transitioning into college. You could take a separate course on accessing higher ed, either a vocational technical track or a 4-year or community college track, but that was a separate course that you had to get permission from your supervisor to take. You couldn't just take it, it wasn't required. And when I was able to give a survey while I was at the TAP course, which is where I got a lot of my information, and I actually asked them, were they planning on taking the higher ed class, and almost all of them said yes. And then I asked them, do you think you'll get to take it? Do you want to take it, but do you think you'll get to take it? And most of them said, no, I won't get to take it. My supervisor won't give me the time off, because it was a 2-day seminar. So, yeah.
So, just in line with the TAP, since you said that you went for it.
Yeah.
So, and you went for it currently, so that's good, So, did you see that they, in that TAP course, they tell them about the state agencies, because there is a lot of state facilities, right? Especially in in Virginia and North Carolina, and some of the nothing.
They talked about,
yeah.
I mean, they gave them book after book and manual after manual, and here's how to access your VA information, and here's how to access this, and here's a list of these agencies, and here's a list of this. It was not,
Yes.
what you could really do for each one.
Excuse me, can we have the presentation and then we'll have
but
time
I'll
for
forget
questions?
about the TAP. So
Jot down your question.
Okay. So, I gathered information. I went through the TAP class. I did a lot of personal interviews. I talked to a lot of different veterans. I mean, obviously my husband's one, and he went to college, to community college first, actually. He was in the Navy, so I went to my Army guys and my Marine Corps guys, and then the survey that I did in the TAP course, and all that, plus my literature review, allowed me to really kind of get in my head, I think these are the difficulties that veterans are facing when they access community college. And you take all that information and you put it into this thing called a Q-sort. So it's a mixed method, non-experimental design. My background is, my master's degree is in wildlife biology, so I'm very much a quantitative person. I collect data, I analyze it, that draw my conclusions. So social science was different for me. And we talked about doing this as a qualitative study, and I have to say I was a little bit scared to do a qualitative study. And my advisor is actually one of the founding members of the Q Methodological Society. And so he said, why don't we try this? And we had actually done this in class for a project, and I thought, well, this might work. But what you do with a Q-sort is you can study qualitative data quantitatively. So you take and you come up with statements that you believe apply to your problem. So from my literature and my TAP course and the survey and my personal interviews, I came up with a list of 47 statements that I think characterize the transitional process into community college. So some of my statements were, I had difficulty with the way information was delivered in class. I did not feel safe in the classroom, and it's from a first-person point of view. I felt that other students did not understand my background. I was asked uncomfortable questions about my military service. I did not understand how information was delivered in the classroom. I did not understand how to access my GI Bill. I did not have good student support services. And so I have a list of 47 different questions. And then what they do with a Q-sort is you develop this Q set of 47 statements, and then you have your P set, your participants. I had 24 participants. Great thing about a Q-sort is you're supposed to have half the number of participants as you have concourse items. So you don't have to have a massively huge number of individuals, because remember, this is mixed method. This is qualitative and quantitative. So I had 24 participants, and I asked them to rank on a scale of -5 to +5 those statements. And you do that using this diagram for your Q sort. So basically, you put the statements, you can do it on a computer, you can do it with cards. I did it with cards. So I printed the statements out on all these cards, and then I would ask them to lay them down underneath. This is the most agree with, this is least agree with. Mine actually had a +5 and a -5. Most agree with, least agree with. So these are neutral here in the middle. So basically, if you felt that you did not understand how information was delivered in the classroom, and that was your hardest problem, your biggest issue, that was your +5. If your GI Bill was great, you were fine with it, you had no issues whatsoever, that could be your negative. Does that make sense? How that works? And so then what you do is you write down the number, each concourse item was numbered, and you write down where it was ranked for each individual, and then you take all these rankings and you put them into your statistical software, and there's actually a software called R software that you use for Q sorts, and it comes up with it does what we call a factor analysis, and it takes individuals' data and puts them into groups with other individuals that they are similar to. And so what I was hoping was that the groups would show me where do we see these big problems, and if I can look at how the divisions are made, maybe we can see how we could aid each one of these groups of individuals. So I left out all the crazy statistical stuff, but basically my PSET, I had 64% Army, 24% Marine Corps, 88% male, 8% female, 64% did not have children, 44% did have children, half were married, half were unmarried. So pretty typical for veteran students. There's my ethnicity breakdown. There's my age at time of entry into community college. You can see most were between the ages of 20 and 30. This was the rank at discharge. So most of my participants were E4 or E5, which is pretty typical after a one-time enlistment. So most of these individuals were in the military, fulfilled their enlistment obligation, and then exited the military. And I had a couple that were in for a little bit longer. Time between discharge and entry into community college, most of them began immediately or within the first year. So 0 is it was just a couple of months, and then 1 was 1 year, and so forth. So you can see most of them started pretty soon. And then the ranking of difficulty of transition to community college. This was just picked from 1 to 10, and you can see that most of them, I had a lot that picked 3, and then I had a whole bunch that picked 7 and 8. And I'll get back to this in a minute, because this didn't make a lot of sense to me, that I had a bunch that were like really easy and a bunch that were like really hard, so percentage-wise. So I'm going to talk about that again in a minute, because that seemed a little weird, that it was either really difficult or really easy, right? It kind of didn't seem, so that on average, it came out to not so bad. But I looked at a lot of individual data. So my factors fell out. This is the statistics for this. I had, the important thing here is I had 8 individuals in my first group, 5 in my second, 4 in my third, and 5 in my fourth group. And they all agreed on this statement. I had difficulty with how information was delivered in the classroom. A Q sort will give you statements that are called consensus statements, and then it'll give you statements that basically are used to identify each factor group. And I'm just really going to focus on my consensus statement and a couple of other things. So difficulty with how information was delivered in the classroom was a consensus statement. But the thing about a consensus statement is that it doesn't have to be ranked as really good or really bad. This came out as a consensus statement that was ranked at a +1, which is pretty close to neutral, which was not what I expected to see. I expected this to be a really big deal, but it was like not really big deal at all. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. But one of the things that you do with a Q sort is after you have them sort everything out, you have an interview. And when you have your interview, you get to, talk with somebody personally. And what people had told me did not match up with this. People had told me that they had a really hard time or they didn't have a really hard time. So I went back and I started looking at individual data, and individual data suggested that individuals either had a really hard time with the way information was delivered, or they had a really easy time. And these are some distinguishing statements that were common to all the groups. I couldn't maintain motivation to study. Balancing school and work and family was difficult. I had to take developmental courses. We were talking about that yesterday. And that was difficult. And then you can see the rankings for each one. So it doesn't mean, distinguishing doesn't mean that it's all the same. It just means that they all had, this was something that popped up. My GI Bill didn't cover all my course expenses. The behavior of non-military veteran students was difficult for me. Now, you can see that factor 1 is different from factor 2, different from 3, different from 4. And when I tell you who's in the factor groups, this might make a little bit more sense. So here's my 4 factor groups. I had an infantry group. I called them Mission Missing Infantry. I had a group that had difficulty finding balance. I had a group that was motivated or impacted by their disability. Motivation impacted by disability. And then I had a group that needed an administrative advisor. They needed somebody to tell them how to use their GI Bill. So when you go back and you look at this slide, that first group, my infantry group, they were the ones that had problems with behavior. They were the ones that had to take developmental courses. But then like my second group, balancing school and work was really difficult for them. The third group with the disability that identified as disabled, really hard maintaining motivation to study. So it just kind of seems like that they, it fits with their statements. So in my factor 1 group, basically I had 8 members. They were all infantry. Almost all of my Marine Corps was in this one group, which I found really interesting. The Marines stick together. And they really all had similar stories. 3 Army veterans. And when I looked at those Army veterans' MOSs, they were all infantry as well. So everybody in this group was infantry, which typically are individuals that enter the military, have the least amount of training, and come out at the lowest rank. These are also individuals that are more likely to be deployed, to be ground forces, to see action. They're more likely to not have had school before they entered into the military. Their mean ranking for difficulty of transition was 6, and their individual rankings, you can see, were higher than the mean. They were the most stereotypical military group. They were uncomfortable in the classroom. They were uncomfortable with the lack of discipline in the classroom. I actually had one of these guys in one of my classes come up after class and tell me he had gotten up and left in the middle of class. And he came after class to apologize to me. And I said, "It's okay." And he said, "Well, I was so annoyed with the kid that was being rude that I was either going to hit him or I was going to leave." I said, "Well, I'm glad that you left." Because it's hard because you're not used to that type. And he said, I can't stand it. There's no discipline. Nobody has any discipline. And this was a very young student veteran. This was not an older individual. I think he was 22 or 23. But he just could not stand it. A lot of these individuals expressed that they didn't feel like the mission of college was important as their past military mission. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. When I was in the Marines, I knew what I was supposed to be doing. When I was in the Army, I knew what my goal was. I don't really know what my goal is here. This is also the group that, over the years, I have seen more Marine student veterans go back into the Marine Corps than any other group that I've had. I think I've had 5 Marine Corps vets come and tell me, like in the middle of a semester, they were taking my class and tell me, "I'm going back into the Marine Corps." "Are you going to finish your semester?" "Nope, I'm going. I want to go back to my family." So it's a hard transition in the first place, and now you're thrown into a situation where you're not comfortable, undisciplined, and failure is not an option for this group. You complete your mission. You don't fail, and if you do fail, you do it, it's, oh my goodness, it's horrible. And I think that is the core of the issue with this group. I really do. I think that we need to teach our military veterans that failure happens in higher ed. And that doesn't mean that you failed your mission, it's a setback. I think, especially with this group, I think that's one of the biggest things that we're failing to teach people, is that sometimes you don't do well, but you have to, get back up and do it again. In this group, I actually had a lot of narrative comments that they don't have connections with other veterans, that they would really love to have mentorship. They need motivation to be successful. Some of them don't feel safe in the classroom. They would always sit at the back of the room with their back against the wall. They didn't want to sit in the front of the room where people were behind them, which my husband doesn't like to sit with people behind him. Most students have been in school the entirety of their lives. Once in the military, it's like everything you've ever learned is erased and replaced with what the military wants. Then when you're discharged, you're expected to know how to be a civilian immediately. And our TAP courses do not teach our veterans how to be civilians again. I think once you come home from a war where your job was to protect your friends, motivation for a degree is not as vital. And then this was probably my most telling narrative comment of all of my individuals. The Marine Corps instills us failure is not an option. The problem with civilian life is there are going to be failures. Regardless of preparations made, veterans need to understand and exercise self-control once failure has occurred. This was from a young Marine Corps vet who was self-aware enough to realize, this was what was going on. But to me, this is the crux of the whole issue. My other factor groups, this group had difficulty finding balance. This group was really typical of a community college student that has a family and work and life and kids and everything going on. Difficulty transition was a 7. Their military veteran status really did not seem to impact their transition, hardly at all. I had firefighters and combat medics in this group. These guys came into college well. They just had problems, difficulty balancing their coursework. They had some difficulty with GI Bill. A lot of them told me how awful the TAP course was. They were very self-motivated. Veteran students are awesome because they're really motivated to do well. Some of these guys had difficulty with mental health, and when I say guy, I mean ladies as well. I shouldn't say that. Some of them expressed having issues with anxiety and depression. Some of them expressed motivation and study habits were issues. My third group was also a group of non-infantry, an MP, a combat medic, a geospatial engineer, an artillery specialist. All were Army, and these guys, this was my group, this was an all-male group, and this was a group that talked to me about having disabilities and how that impacted their overall college experience. And you can read some of the things that they characterize that group: difficulty with motivation, study habits. This was a group that talked to me a lot about how their MOS didn't translate. How am I going to figure out what I'm supposed to do? Because what I did in the military has nothing to do with what I'm doing now. But they talked to me a lot about PTSD and anxiety, depression, lack of direction. I had a couple talk to me about how I don't have direction now. When I was in the military, somebody told me what I was going to do and when I was going to do it, and how I was going to do it. I knew what my objective was. I don't have an objective. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing in the civilian world. And he said, I think if the military gave us time to experience things and explore careers that we could do outside of the military, that would be really helpful. And then the last group really needed, and there was one Marine Corps vet. This was my one Marine Corps vet that was not in, but he was a higher ranking individual who had been in the Marine Corps, I think, for 12 years before he left. He actually works at our college. He's our VA rep, and so I think that his transitional experience was really different. He was also a, he was a sergeant in, what's it called, the sergeant that's in boot camp?
Drill sergeant.
He was a drill sergeant, so he didn't have problems with what he was supposed to be doing. He was a Marine.
Drill instructor.
Drill instructor. He was a drill instructor, and then he got out after, I think it was like 12 or 16 years. Maybe, yeah. He was my oldest veteran, and I really think he just didn't have the issues that the infantry guys did. Work-life balance, but their big thing was frustration with the GI Bill and financial aid. And then one of them talked about the change in environment. And talked about family and how the military was their family, and when you lose your family, that becomes an issue. The TAP course was not as big a deal for these guys. ACAP is the Army's version of TAP. It's called the Army Career and Alumni Program, and that's the version of the Transitional Assistance Program in the Army. And I had 2 respondents who said that it prepared them fully, which was, they were the only 2 that said that out of all of my groups, and they were a married couple. And it makes me think that because they had each other to rely on, that it was a lot easier for them. So there's always outliers, right? So the common themes: difficulty with transition, difficulty connecting with other veterans. Everybody said if somebody would just tell me what to do and how to do it, or if somebody would tell me that this is normal, or if somebody would tell me how do I need to connect with other veterans, how do I balance everything, is this normal? You know, everybody said if I could find other veterans and talk to other veterans, this would be huge. Community colleges typically don't have veteran student unions. They don't typically have veteran student groups. They don't have money for stuff like that. 4-year universities do, but the community colleges don't tend to. So my conclusions, I did see my 4 viewpoints. Branch of service only seemed to matter in factor 1, my Marine Corps guys, but MOS was huge. MOS was really big. And my infantry group fell into one group with one set of problems. When I went back and talked to them, I think all but 2 of them had not been deployed into a combat situation, and the others had. So it could be related to combat. It could be not related to combat. I think that would be a really interesting thing to continue to look at a little bit further. But the military classroom training, a lot of them talked about how I learned in the military is completely different. So when I took my theories and went back and looked at this, what seemed to be more a way to apply this was developing feelings of academic confidence should be really important. Maybe if we can help veterans develop academic confidence, they'll do better. And then develop those 4S assets in moving through the transitional process, self-support, all those different strategies we talked about at the beginning. So how do we do that? You know, how do we teach military veterans, how to do that? So I told you I was going to go back to this question. So I went back to this question about difficulty with how information was delivered in the classroom and looked at their individual rankings, because remember, they either ranked it as it was really hard or it was really easy. And I went back and looked at what program were they in community college. And the ones that ranked it really, this was easy for me, were in vocational programs. And the ones that ranked it as this was really difficult for me were in academic programs. So I went to the instructors of the vocational programs. This was BLET and fire control training. I went to the instructors of those programs and asked them, how do you teach your courses? Can I see how you teach your courses? And they teach in a very behaviorist way. They teach pretty much the ADDIE model that they had in the military. They even do PT together in the mornings. Like, they come in, they do PT, they do their work. I mean, it's a very militaristic way of learning. And these guys did great. They didn't have any problems with the transition. The academic guys are the ones that told me that it was a big issue. And so based on this, you know, if you try to adjust to something new, you become stressed out. If you become stressed out, it affects your memory and your ability to learn. I mean, everybody knows that. If you're under stress, you don't do well in the classroom. This also affects how your feelings of ease and safety. If you're stressed out, you've got adrenaline, cortisol, you don't feel safe, you don't sleep at night. That could exacerbate any issues you have otherwise. Changing this learning style is a really big deal. I think that's a huge deal, because we're not teaching individuals that are leaving the military how to be successful in our classrooms. So what do I think that we need to do? I think we need to develop programs that connect veterans with other veteran students. I think we need student unions. I think we need disability and mental health services on campuses. And I think we need mentorship, and I think we need workshops. I would love to see a program that was instituted that followed military veterans from the time they exit the military until they enter into college, like an advisor that could advise them from their exit to their entry into college and through the entire process. You know, some type of mentor that could help with anything they need help with, you know, and connect them with other veterans on campus. I think that's big. The military is a family. And when you lose your family, you need help. And even if you did not serve with an individual. My students would tell me, I didn't serve with this person, but this person was a Marine, and he went through the same thing that I went through, and he and we understand each other. But there's no way for these connections to be formed on community college campuses. So, implications, obviously, let's increase graduation and retention, and then we can get higher wage earning opportunities and hopefully less poverty and homelessness. Practice, we need to establish veteran-friendly campuses and classrooms. And veteran students, it would be really good to establish a sense of commonality and community. 22 military veterans on average commit suicide every day. And that's unacceptable. And when you talk with individuals about this, you know, when you talk to individuals who considered suicide, one of the things that they've told me is, I felt so alone because nobody understood what I'd gone through. Like I said, 1% of the population are veterans. I mean, there's 2 veterans in this classroom, which is amazing considering there's only 1% of y'all in the population. But forming those connections is kind of hard. So I think that would be really important for all of us. Future research, you know, these are some things that I'd like to continue with. In light of this, what I learned yesterday, I really think that teaching veterans how to gain wisdom about the transitional process and become self-aware would be really big. You know, developing mentorship programs with advisors that talk about, you know, you need to become self-aware of what your weaknesses are and how to address these weaknesses, and how can we, you know, how can we develop programs that'll best serve things like that. But that really started me thinking a lot. You know, I'm trying to think whose slide it was that was talking about self-awareness was a form of wisdom, and, you know, developing self-awareness would be really big. So, yes, sir.
If Tisha doesn't mind, I'd like to invite her to give the first response, since she has direct personal experience in this sort of, or something like it. So, if you don't mind, if you could offer some comments from